All right, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Good morning. My name is Ella McDougall, and I'm the Senior Coastal Resilience Program Manager at the California Ocean Protection Council, where I serve as the lead for the California Beach Resiliency Plan. So welcome to the webinar. Thank you all for joining us today as we learn about this exciting statewide effort. A quick overview of our agenda for the day. We're going to do a welcome and some project background, followed by a full presentation by our Beach Resiliency Plan project team, where they'll share information about the project, the status, goals and deliverables, and some of the key considerations shaping beach resilience in California. We will also have a Mentimeter survey to share feedback, so stay tuned for directions and ways to access that. And then we'll conclude with a facilitated Q&A session and discussion as we can with so many folks on the line. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items. First, we ask that participants use the Q&A function to submit questions throughout the webinar, and we will answer those either as we go or at the end during the facilitated discussion. If you're unfamiliar, that function is down in the bottom bar of Zoom near the chat or the raise hand button. We'll be monitoring those as we go, and then we'll have dedicated time for discussion at the end of the presentation. If needed during that discussion time, we'll ask you to come off mute or raise your hand so we can hear from you and have a bit of a conversation. But otherwise, please mute yourselves and feel free to turn off your videos, as we'll be sharing screen for most of this webinar, and there's a lot of folks on the line. We don't want to cause any Zoom fatigue. This webinar is being recorded so that we can share it with those who aren't able to make it today. So with that, Charles, if you don't mind starting the presentation, I'm going to get into our slides. Okay, great. So the California Beach Resiliency Plan was developed in response to a growing statewide need to better understand and prepare for the impacts of sea level rise on California's beaches. The project brings together experts from across disciplines, including coastal geomorphology, ecology, economics, planning, tribes, public engagement, and a lot more, to help answer the fundamental question: how do we ensure California's beaches remain resilient for future generations? Slide, please. The goals of the project are threefold. First, we want to bring greater awareness to the vulnerability of California's beaches to sea level rise. While we know beaches are facing increasing pressures from erosion, coastal storms, and rising seas, the impacts are not uniform across the state. Understanding where or which beaches are most vulnerable and what specifically may be at risk is a critical first step towards informing adaptation. Second, we want to support and accelerate the localized, integrated adaptation planning. Communities across California are already beginning to grapple with these difficult decisions around beach management, access, habitat protection, and infrastructure. The plan is intended to therefore provide that information and guidance to help support these conversations and these decisions. And then third, we want to help frame some statewide policy decisions around how to protect beaches in the face of climate change, especially sea level rise. A lot of those challenges that affect beaches extend beyond just the local boundaries. And then many of those challenges require extreme and highly coordinated communication across jurisdictions, agencies, and various levels of government. So these goals that I've laid out ultimately in the plan are going to translate into three major deliverables. Slide, please. To support goal one, we're looking at county level snapshots that characterize the beach functions, the values, and the vulnerabilities across California. These snapshots will help communities better understand local conditions and how they may change over time. We think of it sort of as like level setting for anyone who's curious about the status of their local beaches, bringing in best available science. To support goal two, the project will develop decision guidance for addressing beach resiliency. And the goal of that is to help local governments and coastal managers evaluate adaptation options, understanding trade-offs, and identify strategies that align with local priorities. And we're really going to dig into this decision guidance today throughout the rest of our presentation. And to support goal three, as we've already discussed, we have We plan on providing state policy recommendations that identify those opportunities for improving coordination across jurisdictions, recommending investments and long-term resilience planning across California. And together, these deliverables are going to help provide a common foundation for understanding beach resilience and supporting informed decisions at local, regional, and statewide scales. And with that, I would actually like to see if our Executive Director, Jen Eckerly, is on the line to give a few words and welcome folks. So Charles, if you don't mind taking down your screen, I'd love to welcome Jen Eckerly.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ella. I'm sorry I am late, but I'm really happy to be here. My name is Jen Eckerly. I'm the Executive Director of the Ocean Protection Council. I also serve as Deputy Secretary for Oceans and Coastal Policy for the Natural Resources Agency. I want to thank everyone for joining us today to learn more about the California Beach Resiliency Plan. For those of you who might not be familiar with the Ocean Protection Council or OPC, we were established through the California Ocean Protection Act in 2004, and we work to ensure California maintains healthy, resilient, and productive ocean and coastal ecosystems now and into the future. We do this by bringing together science, policy, partnerships to address some of the most pressing challenges facing our coast and ocean. And as we all know here, one of those significant challenges is climate change and sea level rise. In OPC's previous strategic plan that took us through 2025 and the Sea Level Rise Action Plan, we identified beach resilience as a critical statewide priority and specifically called for the development of a California Beach Resiliency Plan. In response, our council approved funding for this effort in 2023 and formally launched the project with UC Santa Barbara in 2024. California's beaches are among our most beloved natural resources. They provide habitat for wildlife, support local economies, offer recreational opportunities, ensure public access to the coast. Yet they are increasingly threatened by the impacts of sea level rise, erosion, changing storm patterns, and other climate-related impacts. At the same time, local governments and coastal managers are being asked to make difficult decisions about how to adapt to these changes. While there's a wealth of scientific information available, there has not been a single statewide effort to bring best available science forward and to translate it into practical guidance for decision makers. That's the purpose of the California Beach Resiliency Plan. Together with the University of California, Santa Barbara and OPC, we are bringing together experts across disciplines to better understand the vulnerability of our beloved California beaches, identify adaptation opportunities, and develop tools and recommendations that can help communities prioritize investment and strategies for the future. So today's webinar is really an opportunity to learn more about the project, hear directly from the research team, and share your perspectives as the plan continues to develop. We really appreciate your interest and your engagement, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. And with that, I will turn it back over to Ella.
Thank you so much, Jen. It's really helpful to get the history and background and context of why we're here today and the purpose of the Beach Resiliency Plan. With that, I do just want to turn it back over to Dr. Charles Lester, who is the director of the Ocean and Coastal Policy Center at UC Santa Barbara and the principal investigator for the Beach Resiliency Plan, who's going to walk through everything with us. So thank you, Jen, and over to you, Charles.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Ella, for that great overview, and thanks, Jen, for your framing of the big picture for us. I'll touch on that a little bit as we go, but I think that's a really important way to understand what this is all about. Before I get into some of the content, we did want to highlight this Menti feedback mechanism for you. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, but if you scan the QR code or go to the website and enter the code, you'll be brought to this screen where you can provide us feedback. These questions are generic through the course of the presentation, and so we're just looking for your real-time reactions, comments, questions, concerns about the content as we go through. So that's hopefully a way to gather as much information as possible from this engagement session. One of the things that you could try to do is identify what it is you're commenting on, if it's a particular step in the sequence that we're going to be talking about, or a particular question. The mentee is anonymous, so feel free to weigh in heavily and with constructive criticism. We won't know who you are unless you tell us something about what you're doing specifically. So we're looking forward to that kind of feedback, and just feel free to enter it as we go. So as you heard, beaches are really, really important to California, and really all around the world. But all the reasons why we care about beaches made us recognize from the very beginning that we needed to have a multi-dimensional examination of the question of beaches and beach resilience. So, understanding that there are many different values involved in our beaches has led us to create this interdisciplinary team, and it's really been an amazing process so far to be working with this team, although we're right in the thick of it. And you can imagine the challenges we're facing, but we've got folks from USGS and CSU Channel Islands working on the geophysical components of beaches. We've got ecological thinking happening with Point Blue and others at UCSB. I see Jenny Dugan online today. We've got access and recreation also being focused on with folks from CSU Channel Islands. Cultural and tribal dimensions of beaches are a really important part of our assessment, and so Strategic Earth has been leading that for us. Environmental justice also is critically important as we think about our beaches, and so folks at UCSB and Channel Islands are also focusing on that. And then finally, CEDO Consulting and Phil King is helping us with the economics dimension. I think I saw Phil online today too. So the idea is to bring together multidisciplinary perspectives around beaches so we can begin to understand the different values and functions that beaches provide to us. They're not single dimensions, they're not unidimensional. And they're a combination of environmental and social cultural aspects. So recognizing that caused us to ask, well, how are we going to frame this question of beach resilience? And it requires a framework that recognizes there are multiple dimensions and that those dimensions are connected and they affect each other. So the systems diagram you see on the right is a work in progress, but the intention is to frame this problem as one where we're understanding that beaches are shaped by physical changes, the environment, climate change, of course, is the big one, ecological dimensions. Those physical aspects shape the beaches that we see and their distribution, their extent, their character. But we also shape beaches through our social activities and our values and actions. And so we're explicitly recognizing that beaches are social constructions as well as physical things. So understanding that and trying to understand the relationships between these different values and functions. Right here we have the various values and functions that you could think of in our beaches. They're cultural and civic space. They provide ecological value. Environmental justice is a critical dimension of beach engagement. Tribal and cultural stewardship is embodied in our beaches. Economic value, and of course risk mitigation, where they are performing that function along developed shorelines. So understanding how beaches are providing those functions and values, and then asking how are those values going to change, and what is our adaptive capacity for making sure that beaches continue to provide those values to us, is kind of the core conceptual framing. So on the left here, we're asking to what extent are our beaches and our beach system able to resist, rebound, adapt, or transform in response to the changes that we're concerned about, and particularly climate change. So another key piece of this framework is asking the question about that adaptive capacity. And one of the things we're looking at is this idea of beach accommodation space. And so on the left-hand side, you see a schematic that shows you the spectrum from the ocean side to the inland side. And in between, we have beaches, which we understand is this space between the water and the back of the beach. And, that technical people will argue vigorously about how to understand that. But beaches are in that space, and then asking to what extent do we have the accommodation space to allow for those beaches to recede or regress inland as needed in light of sea level rise. So the ideas on the right-hand side are recognizing that we need to think about this idea of accommodation space. We need to think about the erodibility of our back shores, whether they're developed or whether they're open dunes, for example, and what that erodibility and the feasibility of a beach system moving back is. And then, of course, thinking about feasibility broadly, and we can talk for hours about that. But that's a key component that's setting up our assessment. We're also recognizing that beaches are things that take place within multiple geographies. So the scale of a beach, if you're going to think about how beaches work, needs to be thought about very locally and also at the level of the sand shed. And in between, you might have littoral cells and counties and cities and different geographic scales that you need to think about in order to understand your beaches. So we're trying to weave those layers together a little bit, or provide more clearly, provide direction about how you might begin to do that. So the rest of the time, I'm mostly going to focus on this decision guidance piece. That said, we are interested in your feedback through the Menti meter broadly. So if you have general comments about the overall undertaking, that would be great also. The decision guidance is really a core piece, as Ella mentioned, of what OPC is trying to get out or hoping to get out of this project, which is pushing out to communities and the local level guidance about how to begin understanding this question of beach resilience. And one thing to say at the outset is this is a conceptual framework, so a cycle of eight functional decision questions that we need to address to think about beach resiliency. But we also recognize that communities and people and organizations are at different places in this. And of course, we all know we've been thinking about beaches and access and recreation and ecology for like 50 years. So this is not new. These are not new questions for us, but we're trying to put it into a framework which makes sense for where you are. And so it might be you want to follow through this entire sequence from step one, or you might need to mix and match and grab from different pieces of the process. But the idea is to give you the tools or guidance and direction to address any one of these particular questions. So I'm just going to march through these. Phase one, we're calling launching a beach partnership. And you might think about this as what would you do if you were at a city, for example, and you wanted to bring this effort forward to your council. This is when you're framing out, well, why are we doing this? What's the purpose of this project? What are the authorities we're trying to speak to? And most importantly, who do we need to work with in order to create this framework of resilience planning? And so this idea of co-producing a plan or a strategy with your community is really critical. And so these bullets here identify some of the things that you would be thinking about at this step. You're clarifying your goals, the decision context for where you are, your jurisdiction, how your effort might align with the Coastal Act, your LCP, SB 272, which is a critical new driver of adaptation planning, other relevant authorities. You're identifying your governance structure, the roles you have in your city or county, implementation pathways, policies, projects, programs that are already going on. And then you're thinking about this idea of co-production, particularly with your tribal partners, and tribal engagement would be a really critical component of identifying your strategy for community engagement broadly. And then finally, mapping your related planning that's ongoing, which there's a lot of, and there are a lot of interconnections. So again, thinking about how this question of beach resilience might relate to those other projects or processes is really important. Once you have sort of laid out why you're doing this and who you're doing it with, you want to begin to understand your beach system. And so the goal here is to get a shared understanding of how beaches work. And again, this is a physical exercise of where are your beaches, what kinds of beaches do you have, what are the cultural settings for those beaches, but it's also understanding the social dimensions of your beaches, existing conditions. So what are your human use patterns that you have in your particular beach system or community? Similarly, what is the economic value or the ecological value of your existing beaches? So trying to develop that understanding of how your beaches work in your place. Once you understand that and the different disciplinary dimensions of how beaches work, it's important to then clarify or begin to clarify better what really matters within those dimensions of your beaches. What do you care about? Where are those things that you care about? And begin to think about the relative value of all of these pieces. So what are your community values across the system you've now characterized? And mapping the distribution and intensity of values. So for example, with ecology, are there beaches within your place or your jurisdiction that have a particular ecological value that's really important to make sure that we protect? Or is there a location that's a hot tourist location bringing lots of economic value and user conflicts to your community? So beginning to understand the values of that mapped beach system, and then also beginning to surface what you really care about if you think about this as a portfolio. And I'll come back to this, one of the tensions we're thinking about is, it's one thing to think about an individual beach, it's another thing to think about the beaches within your community and how would you make that portfolio of beaches resilient? And it might be a mixture of, some beaches are doing one thing, other beaches are doing another. But thinking about that mix of values that are being provided is an aspect of this assessment. And then, of course, beginning to surface those potential conflicts, which we know about a lot, but are not necessarily easy to deal with, and thinking about how those might play out over the system. So once you've identified how your system works and what you care about within that system, then you want to ask, okay, what is at risk for these things that we care about, and who is going to be impacted directly or more directly by these risks, and under what conditions? So how is change and different tipping points or thresholds going to affect these different things that you care about with respect to your beaches? So evaluating the vulnerability, and again, it's not just physical vulnerability, but also ecological, social, cultural, economic, all of these things are changing. And so while sea level rise and climate change are, key drivers to this effort, we're also concerned about social changes and how those might interact with physical beach changes and make new vulnerabilities. And of course, that raises questions about environmental justice, equity, the distribution of beaches across the system. So we've got our values, we understand how the beach works, we understand how it might be vulnerable in the future. We then need to begin exploring options about what we're going to do about it. And this is really more of an entree into the adaptation pathway discussion, where we're asking from the standpoint of the beach and beach form and function, what are the things we could do to change how the beaches are functioning and the values they're providing. So this is really the heart of one thing that I think is important about this project, which is it's a beach-centered approach. It's a vulnerability assessment of beaches, not development, although that's obviously part of the equation, but we're focused on beaches as the main driver of this effort. And that causes us to think about the connections in a different way across the community and beyond the physical line between the beach and development. So it's a beach-centered adaptation framework. We're asking about strategies that we could use for specific beaches, for shoreline reaches, and for the broader portfolio, again, of all the beaches that you may be concerned about. And evaluating effects across all of the resiliency dimensions and surfacing trade-offs. So, very quickly it gets very complicated. And if I seem a little fatigued, it's because we're right in the middle of that right now, trying to, sort out those integration questions and how you would deal with it all at once. So it's an adaptation exploration at this stage, where you're beginning to understand what are the things we could do, like what if we continue to armor, what would that mean for the beaches? What if we tried to do some planned retreat in various places? How would that work? What if we built a groin, or the kind of questions that are being asked in ocean side, about the artificial headlands and beach replenishment as a strategy, or artificial reefs, understanding what those options are. Once your community has really engaged with possibilities, then you begin to get down to the brass tacks of, okay, what strategy do we want to adopt or pursue? And what are the alternative pathways that we could use to get to the place we want to be with the values that you've previously clarified? So beginning to think more clearly about the trade-offs of different kinds of interventions or pathways, considering costs, feasibility, to what extent are strategies going to provide the values and benefits that you're trying to accomplish within that system. So this is a pretty standard, in some ways, consideration of alternatives and to what extent they'll realize what you're trying to get to. Of course, we all know that a strategy is one thing, but actually doing it is another. And so this step is about then translating your strategy into who's going to do it, where are they going to do it, when are they going to do it, how are they going to do it. And if you don't have this step in your planning process, then you might as well not have the strategy, I think. So you're translating your strategies into policy, projects, programs, investments. You're assigning roles and responsibilities and future partnerships. You're sequencing your actions over time with triggers and funding alignment. And then you're integrating that into all of your other activities. So LCP updates, capital planning, permitting operations. We already have some great examples of this happening in adaptation planning, like San Francisco has done this capital planning translation process. City of Santa Cruz has done some of this with their adaptation actions. So recognizing that you need to have the who, where, the when, and the how for your strategy to move forward. And then finally, stepping back and asking, well, is it working, and what needs to change if it's not? And so this is, again, a common step in a planning process or an implementation framework, where you're asking about the performance of your strategy, monitoring your indicators of the things you care about in that system. What are the thresholds and triggers that might be driving your adaptation pathways, evaluating outcomes, both individual sites and across your portfolio, and then updating your strategy through time. So it's an ongoing management process and engagement process. And that engagement question is something we're also trying to really raise up in this assessment. And you might have noticed in this overall schematic that we've got community engagement as something that's important through every phase or step of this process, or these functional decisions. And this is not new, but I think it's important that we think about engagement not as, in points along a decision arrow where you allow the public to tell us what they think. Rather, it's a conversation where you're engaging with your community throughout. And so there's a connectedness to that interaction or engagement that continues through this sequence. On the right-hand side is a chart from this document, Facilitating Power, which is something we've been thinking about also in our engagement discussions, which is the nature of the engagement that you're doing. So not just that it's a conversation, but that you're moving from less engaging ways of working with people to more engaging. And that's that spectrum there, from example, informing people about what you're doing or consulting with them, to involving them, to collaborating, to actually co-producing content with the folks who are interested in what you're doing. So that's something that we're making sure to develop, and the guidance would also be providing examples or ways to do engagement that's more engaging. Sounds silly, but I mean, that's what we're talking about. And so just taking a step back, those are the 8 steps, but how are we to think about this through time? And I think it's worth noting that, at least in my mind, adaptation planning is never really finished. It's a cycle of cycles. And this is conveying the idea that, well, once you go through those 8 steps, you're going to start the next step. And so something to think about is this a decadal sequence? Is it a 20-year plan that you might be thinking about in terms of your strategy? But recognizing that you're always going to be evolving this process with respect to your beaches. And I mean, we are all talking about the prospect for beach resilience in 50 or 75 years. So it is something that we have to keep thinking about over time and not letting go, not thinking we're done once we've done this once. And then also similarly at the larger level, I think it's important that we think about, well, what do we mean by community-based planning? And especially when we're talking about beaches, given the way they function, the reality of how they're important across a variety of geographies. We need to understand that communities that care about beaches, especially in California, are also at different scales. So we all know that one of the reasons we have a beach protection program in California is because we recognize that's a statewide value. It's not just about the communities that are on the shoreline. We also have different jurisdictional scales, like at the county level, or larger physical systems that are shaping the interaction. So the littoral cell and your beach community might not be just your county. It might be Ventura and Santa Barbara County that work through Beacon because the sand is connected, right? And then similarly, we've had a lot of discussion, especially with the Coastal Commission, about neighborhood scale and the tension between neighborhood scale planning and parcel level planning. And that's also important. But the idea that we're trying to keep, again, surfaced or centered is that you need to think about all of these different levels of geography when you're thinking about, well, who's the community that we're planning for? And that will be fundamental to shaping the kinds of answers you get to those different questions we just ran through. So that's the decision guidance. Now, just a brief one slide on this idea of a snapshot. And this is a conceptual approach that we're showing here. Also, still probably in negotiation with Ella. I'm not sure. We haven't talked about it lately, but this is a 6-page snapshot, right, for a county. We were thinking that it would be something that would capture some basic metrics across our different dimensions that we're looking at. Might have a map that characterizes the sand and the maybe the visitation patterns, but understanding the geography of that county. And then a more textual, pithy discussion across the different categories about resiliency challenges and opportunities. So it is a snapshot, and it is going to be a one-time look at, well, what do we think about what's happening in this county with respect to the beaches? Not an easy undertaking. I know that we just did the Coast and Ocean report, and that also was a tremendous challenge and produced some great statewide measures of where we are in different places. But here we're trying to characterize at the county level the different things that are happening with respect to beaches, and also with an eye towards not just providing that information to the public in those places, but also being able to compare them. So we will be thinking statewide and then regionally when we're producing these syntheses of the data. So I think that is it for what I wanted to say for now. And I'm happy to engage in discussion. There's a lot there, but I didn't want to go on too long, Ella.
Thank you so much, Charles. That was great. Just great to see the overview. Give us a lot more detail, focusing a lot on decision guidance, which is really important and what we really are seeking, a lot of feedback on. So that's our presentation, folks. So we're open for questions now. We have the Q&A function, the chat function, and considering, I think it would be fine if we raised hands and took you off mute for a question as well. So let's get into it.
You want me to keep the screen up?
No, I don't think you need to. We can put our emails in the chat. We do have a question in our Q&A, and I will read this out. We can all chime in. At what points are other state agencies or tribes consulted about potential impacts? Is it throughout or at certain phases? Charles, do you want to take that?
Sure. Um, I think it's, generally throughout all phases, but that would be, that's the importance of the first phase, really, of identifying who the uh, people are and the organizations are that you're going to need to work with closely throughout in order to think about beach resilience. So some communities, the relationship with state parks might be really important because most of their beaches are state parks beaches. And so you're going to want to start talking with parks from the very beginning and then understand what their understanding of how the beaches work. Obviously, they're going to be critical technical input on how they work, understanding the data and the users and activities, but also, the things state parks is responsible for managing for within those beaches, the values, and then vulnerability, et cetera, adaptation options. You're not going to, intervene on a state park beach without state parks participating. So, it really depends on who it is and what your jurisdiction looks like, but I'd say throughout. And same with other agencies. You might be working with the water board if you have a beach water quality issue, Fish and Wildlife for ecological questions that might be coming up, or the management of special species that are appearing in your place. So it's really going to depend. But again, I think it should be driven by the relevance of that conversation to the particular questions you're asking.
Charles, would you be okay if we let Bree chime in on the tribal piece?
Yeah. Hi, Bree.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Bree Goodwin. I am co-leading the Strategic Earth team, looking at the cultural and tribal aspects of the California Beach Resiliency Plan. And just to hone in a little more on the tribal aspect of that question, um, also just clarifying there's what we call the little C consultation. And so that's the engagement from the start of really the idea phase and working with tribes with ancestral ties to the area that the plan is being developed for. And then there's, of course, the big C consultation, or the legally required consultation, and that early engagement can help make that process smoother. But when we're getting to consultation, the formal sense, that's in statute. And so that'll be getting to the government to government consultation level.
Thanks for
Great.
that, Bree. I think that's one of the things that the team is learning, and I know I'm learning, is that, talking about tribal engagement is complicated and it's nuanced. And so there are lots of different dimensions that need to be developed more fully in a process like this. And that would also be a specific focus of the step one, developing a tribal engagement plan that is sensitive to all these kinds of concerns.
And just to reiterate, once we do go through the tribal engagement and our working groups, OPC will do formal consultation on the beach resiliency plan before it is near final. So just sharing that government to government consultation will also occur. Thank you for that question. I do believe that there are some questions in the Mentimeter, and Lilia, I'm wondering if you can share some of them. Thank you.
Yeah, we've got a couple in here, so maybe I'll start with one or two, and then we can jump back to the Q&A. First being, someone asked, how can we do monitoring across entire regional systems? The impacts of activities on one beach can impact neighbors. How can we do this in places without a regional management structure?
Well, that's a great question, and it's regional monitoring is something that's being focused on and by a number of different parties. I'm most familiar with what Beacon has been doing in Santa Barbara and Ventura, but um, we've done a lot of monitoring over the decades, but it hasn't necessarily been connected or integrated with all the other monitoring, and understanding the right scale for monitoring is important. And so we're not necessarily pulling all of that monitoring information together in this plan, but we're recognizing that that's something that needs to happen. And so I could see discussions of that happening in the statewide recommendations, for example. How can we facilitate or hold up that kind of regional monitoring effort? I think we've been making a lot of great headway on that, especially with technological, changes and the ability to bring data together. But USGS and others are kind of playing a critical role in synthesizing some of that data.
If I can, Charles, I also would love to chime in on statewide monitoring methods. I got a question. I don't know if it's the exact same question or a similar question on statewide monitoring. I do want to just say that the status of monitoring statewide is interesting and challenging. There's a lot of data, a lot of it is piecemeal, and a lot of it is at will data. And so OPC, at least from our perspective, recognizes that that's a need and a gap, especially as we're, striving to encourage local practitioners and jurisdictions to make their own adaptation decisions via informed guidance such as this. But data is not necessarily there. And so we actually in our strategic plan have kind of a new, we'll call it a new initiative, but it's not new, of tracking change over time, which is looking at those giant gaps in monitoring. So that is something that we're working on. It is, of course, a really complicated question. We had our Coast and Ocean report that came out recently, which a lot of it was in kind of, like the subtext of it was like, well, what's missing then? If we know a lot about these sorts of things within the state and within our coast and ocean, what might be missing? So the state and OPC is also working on ensuring that we have aligned and coordinated strategies for monitoring across the state.
Yeah, and if I could just bounce off of that, and one of the reasons we're thinking about these 8 decision functions is to understand the connection between them. And so, to me, monitoring only makes sense if it's clearly connected to what you care about. Why are you monitoring it? And so, it's important to, if we're thinking about beaches, to understand, okay, what are we monitoring about beaches and why? And some of the, although we aren't going to be, delivering a statewide beach monitoring plan, we will be framing questions like the Coast and Ocean report, for example, looks at beaches and highlights the recent synthesis of some of the COSAT data and how much beaches might have changed in the regions, right? Based on that COSAT data. But that COSAT data is a 40-year time series from 1982 to today. And we're concerned about what's going to happen to that time series to 2100 as sea level rises. And so understanding what data shows and how to interpret it is a really important part of developing a monitoring program. And I think it's in the state's interest to not monitor things that are just like interesting details that don't relate to anything we care about.
Thank you. Yep. Okay. I see
Can
Phil's
I
hand.
chime in for
Sure.
one point? This is Phil. For some reason, it just cut off my video. I don't know what I did wrong. But at any rate, the one thing I wanted to make was the social science data is pretty limited throughout the state. And I've made this point over and over again. We're using cell phone data for this project, for the economics, and also for some of the other social sciences. But I do expect that that's going to be one of the outcomes of this report is to say we really need to do a better job on the social science side. And I know other social scientists have actually told me as the economist that I'm in better shape than most other social scientists because at least there's some funding for economics. But I think that's something to keep in mind.
There is also more economic data than other kinds of social data generally, which is, good from one standpoint. Um, I, just to build on that, Phil, I think you're right to highlight that, and going back to this idea of the interdisciplinary examination, it really is forcing us to recognize that beaches aren't just, it's not just about, where's the sand coming and going to, and how can we intervene or put more on the shoreline. There are all these social aspects of how beaches work and what we care about, and that those are going to be really critical to connect back to the physical functioning of the system. That said, I can address this one question that came up in the Menti, I guess, about how far upstream should beach planning be, and or in who should it involve. I briefly touched on that. In our view, I think we are trying to set up that in step 2, how do your beaches work? It's really important to understand sand. And we've done a lot of coastal sediment management planning in California. I think many of us feel like it hasn't been quite realized fully in terms of the potential for helping us make better decisions and adapt. But the point of that planning is to understand that sand is part of a sand shed, or beaches are part of a sand shed. And you need to understand that whether your beaches are going to persist or not has a lot to do with how much sand is coming out of the rivers, for example. And it may be that in your long run strategizing, you realize that, what, the single most important thing we could do is work with this dam over here to remove it and start transporting sand back to the coastal system. Maybe. We've been doing that also already, but I think it is important that we plan upstream. And that, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's how beaches work. So that's the point of really trying to zero in on what are the key drivers in your place for the persistence of a system or not. And that can be at different scales and details. So folks who are looking at dune systems, especially the larger dune systems, understand how those dune systems are part of the sand delivery process in that area. So you may have that happening in your place, you may not. Will we develop? We are developing county snapshots, and we're hoping that there'll be meaningful expressions of what's happening in each county. But reading between the lines on that question, I'd say that would be a starting point, like for a county interested in this set of questions, to say, oh, this is what's happening in our county, and then you might take that as the launch point for updating it every 5 years, or how are we doing, or beginning to identify key metrics and values that you want to focus on in your county. So, but there will be snapshots, today.
Charles, I want to jump in with a question that came through from our Q&A, which is about vulnerability, or phase 1 in the beginning of the decision guidance. Are you envisioning extending the Cosmos work to a final resolution to assess vulnerability? So what data would you say will be in that piece?
For vulnerability?
Yeah.
Well, so I'm not sure I'm following the connection to phase 1, but understanding vulnerability is one of the drivers for why we might be doing this. So we certainly have a lot of discussion at varying levels of detail about the real risks to our beaches over the long term if we don't do anything different, especially in urban places that are armored. So we stand to lose a lot of beach area. The Cosmos thinking is part of this project. We do have Sean Batusek. I don't know if he's on today, but he's on the team from USGS, and he's, of course, integral to that model, or has been working a lot with that model. And part of our work program is to look at refinements in that model, in particular, thinking about, and I didn't go into this with the accommodation space discussion, but thinking about how the shoreline moves in relationship to the backshore and vice versa. So that space between the shoreline or the mean high tide, however you define that, and the back of the beach where the upper reach of the waves is, or defines that beach area, is critical to how much space remains as sea level rises. And so I think the Coastal Commission is also doing some work on this question more at a more technical level. But you know, if you have a dune system that's easily erodible, then that whole beach accommodation space or buffer is going to move back more easily with sea level rise. If you have a hard rock cliff face, it's less so. And one of the critical questions I think for all of us is, to what extent might some beaches not persist anyway, no matter what we do? Because the erosion at the backshore won't keep up with sea level rise over the long run. It's a, you know, a hypothesis for some.
And then would you take it one step further? Another question that just came through is asking about continued armoring and where that would be problematic. So could you talk about like how a little bit more about the geology of the backshore and how we're using this decision guidance to looking at armoring?
So one of the things we're also developing, work in progress, is and Lilia can go into the details of the challenges if you all want to hear them, but updating our understanding of our shoreline statewide, and what is that backshore. And so one of the kinds of backshores you can have is urban slash development slash armoring. And so we are, you know, relying on Coastal Commission data and existing data that we have about where the shore is already armored. It's probably not surprising for me to say something like, we know that beaches are probably more endangered or more vulnerable in urbanized areas that have lots of armor. And so we are going to be highlighting that to the extent we can with the data available, saying, you know, by the way, all of these beaches in your community are really vulnerable because they happen to be, you know, have hard backshores currently. That will both identify a vulnerability in a particular urbanized place and also a potential challenge if you want to figure out, well, what are we going to do about that? What are the opportunities for, you know, restoring or moving in different places in different ways? The other piece of that question I think that's important to highlight is we're thinking about that in relationship to the other values. So again, this is not a new observation, but it happens that a lot of the places that are most armored are also the most visited or most important to the community access function, and including Californians inland. So where do people in San Jose go to the beach? They come to Santa Cruz, which is, Santa Cruz County is about 75% armored in the urban area. Yes, it has a lot of great beaches to the south or down coast of the urban area, but that urban core is probably more vulnerable and more visited. So thinking about how those things are going to intersect and what it might mean for future distribution of beach use, for example, and the beach economy are all kinds of things that this look would set up.
Thank you. We have about 4 minutes left, so I have one question that I think I will take, and then Charles, I will toss you the last question, which should close us out pretty well. So this question is asking about the next steps after the beach resiliency plan, and if and how counties and cities or jurisdictions are intended to take this guidance, and if there's funding available for making plans and resilience strategies, et cetera, as recommended in the plan. So we do have our SB1 grant program. That funding is available for all cities and counties to write sea level rise adaptation plans that can tie into land use plans. And the hope is that beach resilience is very closely tied to your sea level rise adaptation plan, and that these strategies can be taken into the SB1 plans and projects that are available now and rolling. So I do want to do a little plug for that planning and that next step. So that's open, and we have technical assistance available for that, and funding is available for cities and counties to do their planning. We do have track two that is ongoing, or that has opened now, and we're looking at some implementation projects. So lots coming in terms of funding for planning and projects through OPC. Okay, and then the last question with 3 minutes to go is about timeline. When are we doing, when will we have a draft? When are we doing more input? Will there be further meetings? And when are we looking to finalize and release the plan?
Well, subject to confirmation from Ella, we're right in the middle of, in the thick of things on all fronts, really. And we haven't really pulled together material on the statewide piece yet, but we're working heavily on the development of the metrics for snapshots and the characterizations for those snapshots. So the team is all working on packaging that information. And we've been working a lot on the decision guidance and kind of the details of that. And so it's going to be a little while longer on that. Hopefully by this fall, we'll have a draft decision guidance piece anyway that could be considered. I think in terms of the overall plan, we're looking at the spring, March maybe, possibly a little later than that. It depends on how the grant unfolds at the back end, I guess. My sense is, again, subject to OPC's oversight, that we'll be going another year into next summer before there's something really ready. So that's in terms of the engagement. I do want to say thanks to everybody for coming to the meeting today. Recognize it's a lot of information to kind of dump in 20 minutes. And so we really would appreciate any and all feedback that you have and would like to give in whatever form. So I'm happy to engage in emailing or conversation too if you have specific concerns or examples or questions about how this might work, or suggestions about how to make it work. And that's really, I think, what we're partly struggling with too, is how can we create something that's going to be useful? I think that's the most important thing for us to try to do, not just a conceptual treatise on the shelf about how to think about beach resiliency, but what can you do with this thing? So we do have a steering committee that's providing overarching feedback and guidance. We've been doing targeted outreach within each of the sectoral groups to groups of advisors. So for example, the EJ team has had 2 meetings now with their EJ advisors, which is an extended group of folks working on EJ in California, and other types of interactions are happening in the other groups too. We haven't talked about specific feedback loops as the draft plan materials unfold, but I'm imagining that we'll be doing that some way under a framework with OPC. Whether it's more passive, here's this available for input, or more active, I don't know. That sound right, Ella?
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right. You heard it here first, folks.
We'll explore. Great. Well, it's 12:01. So we will give you all the rest of your day back. Thank you so much for your active participation. And thank you, Charles and the team. Thank you, Lilia. Thank you, everyone who joined us. And thank you, OPC team. Have a great afternoon. And we will continue the conversation. Bye.
Right.